So you're tuning in today, I think, because you're looking to get a real handle on what's unfolding with immigration enforcement right now. Maybe get past just the surface level stuff.
Exactly. We've been digging into a recent CBS News report, and we're going to explore three key areas that it really brings into focus.
Okay.
First, there's the very real human impact. We'll look at some tough family situations. Then, this novel use of the REAO law against a gang, the Tren de Aragua.
Right. RAOC. Interesting.
And finally, these legal battles over using the Alien Enemies Act for deportations. Old law, new context.
Okay. So the plan is to cut through some of the noise, give you the key insights, and maybe understand the why behind these headlines a bit better. Let's jump in, starting with that human cost.
Yeah, the report details two cases that are pretty intense. First, Mahmoud Khalil.
What happened there?
Well, his situation, it really kind of spotlights this tension, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Between, strict enforcement and basic family well-being. His wife actually gave birth while he was held in ICE detention.
Oh, wow. While he was detained.
Yes. And he asked for temporary release just to be there for the birth of his son. It was denied.
Denied. And his wife, I read her statement. She said something like, it felt like a purposeful decision to make me, Mahmoud, and our son suffer. That's pretty heavy.
It's incredibly powerful language, yeah. And it really forces you to think about the human toll these policies can take. What goes
Mhm.
into these decisions? What are the priorities?
Right. What are the factors? It just raises these, I guess, fundamental questions about where, humanitarian concerns fit in with enforcement.
Exactly. Denying release for something like the birth of a child.
Yeah.
It shows how maybe inflexible some detention policies are and the very real deep impact on the people caught up in it.
Okay, then there's the second case. Uh, Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Yeah.
This one seems even more complicated legally.
It takes a very strange turn, yeah. He was actually deported to El Salvador despite having a U.S. court order that said he should be returned to the States.
Wait, so a court ordered him back, but he was deported anyway. How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, that's the core of the issue, and what followed is just as concerning. It became incredibly difficult to get any information about him after the deportation.
I saw that House Democrats went down there.
That's right. A delegation flew to El Salvador trying to push for his release, but they weren't even granted a meeting with him.
No meeting. And they started demanding daily proof of life.
Exactly. That phrase, daily proof of life, it just hangs in the air. It really underlines the lack of transparency, the lack of information, and frankly, the fear for his safety.
Yeah, that phrase, it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the level of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And at first it sounds like DOJ and Homeland Security weren't saying much either.
Very little information initially. It actually took a visit from a Maryland senator to find out he'd been moved. Apparently, he was transferred from this place called Siicot Taro Prison.
Which sounds pretty bad.
Reputedly very harsh conditions, yes. He was moved to a different detention facility nearby, so maybe a slight improvement in immediate conditions,
Mm.
but still so many questions.
And the government stance now is
What's
that he's in a Salvadoran facility, so it's basically out of their hands.
That seems to be the position, yeah. But
Okay.
you still have that U.S. court order for his return hanging out there. So that argument feels, a bit thin, perhaps.
It really makes you wonder about the power, the actual reach of a U.S. court order in these kinds of international situations.
It absolutely does.
Yep.
What are the limits? What are the responsibilities when a U.S. court has spoken? And the fact this might go back to court in Maryland, that the judge is still involved, it suggests this is far from over legally.
So that daily proof of life demand, it's about basic safety, health, but also just a call for transparency from both sides, really.
Precisely. And the whole situation deporting someone who was under a court order to be returned, it makes you ask, where did the system break down?
Yeah, was it a procedural error,
Hmm.
a communication gap, or something else?
It points to potential disconnects, yeah, between maybe different parts of the legal system and the enforcement side. It shows how complex this all is and where things can potentially go wrong.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The report also covers a totally different kind of legal tool being used now, ICO, against the Tren de Aragua gang.
Yes, that's a really significant move. The report highlights this is the first time RICO, that's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, is being applied to this specific Venezuelan gang.
And RICO isn't new, right? That's been around a while.
Oh, definitely not new. It's an age-old federal charge, really. Came about originally to fight organized crime like the mafia. The key thing is it lets prosecutors go after the entire criminal enterprise, not just isolated crimes.
Okay, so why RICO? Why now against this particular gang? What's the strategy?
Well, the thinking could be multi-layered. Using RICO lets the Justice Department target the whole structure, the whole organization of the gang, try to dismantle it from the foundations up rather than just picking off individual members for specific crimes.
So it's about taking down the whole operation.
That's the idea. And there's another angle. RICO charges often carry very serious penalties, which can create a strong incentive for lower-level members to cooperate, to flip, as they say.
Ah, right. Provide information on the higher-ups in exchange for maybe a better deal.
Exactly. That can be crucial for investigators trying to understand and break apart these complex, often secretive networks.
And the report mentioned arrests, 27 of them.
Yes, the Justice Department announced 27 arrests connected to this ARIA push, so that's a concrete result you can point to.
But I guess the big question is, will it work in the long run?
Oh,
Against a gang described as a violent transnational group.
that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Friend Aragua operates across borders. It might have a less centralized structure than traditional mafia families. There are definitely big challenges in applying RICO effectively here. Logistical challenges, legal ones, too.
So using RICO this way, it's described as a novel use. What does that tell us about how the government sees this gang, this threat?
It suggests they're escalating their approach, taking a more aggressive, more comprehensive strategy. Using RTU signals, they view Tren de Aragua not just as a collection of criminals, but as an organized enterprise that needs to be dismantled systemically. Maybe acknowledging that standard policing methods alone aren't enough for this kind of transnational threat.
Okay. Makes sense. Right, third area, and this one sounds historical, the Trump administration using the Alien Enemies Act for deportations.
It is historical, yeah. Very much so. We're talking about a law that gives the government emergency wartime powers, and it dates all the way back to 1798.
1798, wow, and it's hardly ever been used.
Extremely rarely. The report points out the last really significant use was during World War II for the internment of Japanese Americans.
That parallel is stark. So the Trump administration tried to use this act for deportations more recently. What happened?
They did attempt to use these powers, presumably to speed up or broaden deportation efforts, but it got challenged, and the Supreme Court stepped in and put a freeze on those specific deportations.
A freeze order. So it's paused, but the legal fight isn't over.
Not at all. The ACLU is pushing hard to keep that injunction in place, arguing for a much deeper review by the courts. So ultimately, the fate of these deportations under this act, it's up in the air. It rests with the appeals courts and potentially the Supreme Court again.
And in the meantime, the report says flights for people potentially affected by this who are being held in Texas, they're on hold.
That's right. Those flights are grounded for now. The legal challenges have effectively stopped the specific initiative, at least for the moment.
Using wartime powers, from 1798 no less, for immigration enforcement today, I mean, that feels like it opens up a huge can of worms.
Yeah.
Legally and ethically.
It absolutely does. It raises really fundamental questions about executive power. Is it appropriate to use emergency wartime authorities for contemporary immigration issues? What does that mean for due process, for civil liberties? These are the kinds of big, thorny questions the courts are likely wrestling with.
Okay, so kind of wrapping things up here. We've touched on these really personal, often painful stories of families caught in the system.
Yeah, the human side of it all.
Then this shift in legal strategy with RICO against a major gang.
A novel approach, trying something different.
And finally, this really contested use of very old, very powerful wartime laws in the present day.
Right, bringing history into the current debate.
And as you said earlier, there's just a lot of uncertainty still hanging over all of these.
Definitely. What happens to Mahmoud Khalil and his family? Will Kilmar Abrego Garcia ever get back to the U.S.? Is he okay? How effective will RICO actually be against Tren de Aragua? And how will the courts ultimately rule on the Alien Enemies Act? So much is still unresolved.
It really does make you take a step back. When you look at all these different pieces, the individual impact, the legal maneuvering, the reach of government power, it prompts that bigger question, doesn't it? What are the core principles at stake here? How do we manage borders and people fairly and effectively? Lots to keep thinking about based on what we discussed today.
Absolutely. It's complex, and these situations highlight just how many competing values and challenges are involved.